We celebrate independence so loudly that almost no one stops to ask, at what point does self-sufficiency start becoming a shield? In a world that praises the person who handles everything, it's easy to confuse emotional distance with emotional maturity and isolation with competence. Hyper-independence is actually a harmful thought pattern. And this way of thinking often stems from past experiences where it felt safer not to ask for help, and further intensified by toxic culture that glorifies independent productivity, pressuring you into carrying every burden by yourself. This isn't about blaming yourself for being capable. Capability is beautiful, but when every instinct tells you to keep people at arm's length, to never rely on anyone, to downplay your own needs because you don't want to feel vulnerable, something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Today, we are going to explore what hyper-independence really is, why it develops, what it costs you, and how to understand this pattern without judging yourself. Not to take your independence away, but to help you see when it's serving you and when it's limiting the life that you're allowed to build. Before we go deeper, if this conversation is already stirring something in you, follow this show. Share this episode with someone who's been carrying more than they actually will admit. These topics matter, not because they're dramatic, but because they are honest. Now let's continue. Independence is celebrated so loudly that most people never stop to question what version of independence they are actually practicing. Healthy independence is spacious. It gives you room to move, to breathe, to grow. Hyper-independence is something else entirely. It's a form of emotional bracing disguised as strength. To understand the difference with clarity, let's start with healthy independence. Let me explain that first. This is the version that expands your identity. It allows you to make decisions freely, lean on others when it makes sense, and stand on your own when the moment calls for it. So it's flexible and it moves with you. It isn't threatened by connection, it's strengthened by connection. Now, hyper-independence, on the other hand, is rigid. It doesn't adjust. It doesn't breathe. It forms when your mind has collected enough relational data to conclude, accurately or not, that leaning on others is risky. It's not a preference. It's a precaution. A strategy shaped by emotional patterns your conscious mind may not even remember. Here's a way to visualize it, without characters or storylines. Imagine a metal beam designed to hold weight. When crafted, it has a natural flex. It absorbs pressure without cracking. But if the beam is reinforced too lightly, it loses that flex. It becomes sturdy, yes, but also brittle. Hyper-independence works the same way. It strengthens you in the short term but limits your adaptability over time. Now, scientific research supports this distinction. Studies examining avoidance-based coping show that when people face repeated relational unpredictability, the conscious mind adapts by creating a pattern of over-self-reliance and wires this into the brain as a reactive loop. So, instead of this being resilience, it becomes a reaction. And when that reaction becomes rehearsed enough, the conscious mind-brain loop is activated in how the person functions. Emotional distance, decision over control, and a constant sense that everything must be handled alone. There's another very clear difference. Is choice. Healthy independence is a choice. Hyper-independence feels compulsory. You might not even consciously realize when that shift happened. You simply wake up one day and notice you are carrying every emotional load by yourself. Not because you want to, but because something in you concluded you had to. And this is where the confusion often sits. Many people mistake emotional isolation for maturity. But emotional availability doesn't weaken independence. In fact, research on shared emotional load shows that connection reduces cognitive strain and increases clarity of thinking, especially during stressful seasons. So ask yourself, not as judgment, but as an observation. Does your independence feel flexible or fixed? Does it open your life or tighten it? Does it support your identity or compress it? Because independence is powerful, but hyper-independence, when left unexamined, can quietly shape the way you relate, that you respond, and how you navigate your world in ways that will actually limit your emotional breadth without you even realizing it. Hyper-independence doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's shaped, layer by layer, by the conscious mind's attempt to create stability in environments that felt anything but stable. So to understand why someone becomes chronically self-reliant, you have to understand how the mind collects relational data, quietly, constantly, and with remarkable precision. The conscious level of mind is always scanning for patterns in the data from experiences. Repetition without questioning the data is what creates a conscious mind-brain loop that keeps you stuck. And when those repeated experiences include unpredictability, emotional inconsistency, or environments where vulnerability wasn't met with support, the conscious mind adapts. It shifts from openness to protection as a coping mechanism. One of the core drivers of hyper-independence is this relational unpredictability. Research on emotional pattern learning shows that when someone grows up or lives for extended seasons in situations where responses from others are inconsistent, the conscious mind begins rehearsing self-sufficiency as a safety measure. It becomes easier to rely on yourself than to risk the emotional cost of depending on someone else. Unpredictability doesn't always look chaotic either. Sometimes it's very subtle. Moments when emotional needs were just dismissed or minimized or misunderstood. Even small inconsistencies, repeated over time, create a sense that relying on others is unreliable. A one-off won't affect you. So the conscious mind stores those repetitions in the mind-brain-body network as a physical thought, and the brain eventually expresses them through being more distant or over-controlling and keeping one's emotions contained. Another contributor is cognitive overload. When someone faces repeated stress without consistent support, it flips into toxic stress, and their conscious mind learns to take full responsibility for everyone's emotional regulation, not just their own, and that's not a good thing. Studies on cognitive burden show that chronic toxic stress can push people into overfunctioning, managing everything alone because it became the only predictable way to avoid further strain. Hyper-independence often begins as a response to overwhelm. And cultural conditioning also plays a significant role. Many people are taught, directly or indirectly, that being strong means never needing help. Gender norms, family expectations, and cultural narratives all reinforce the idea that independence equals worthiness. But over time, these messages fuse with personal experience and distort your identity. Some individuals are naturally sensitive to relational cues, and when those cues repeatedly signal danger, disappointment, or rejection, the conscious mind becomes highly attuned to potential emotional risk. So hyper-independence is born from that attunement. It's not a flaw, it's a form of toxic emotional intelligence. In neuroscience, there is a concept known as predictive coding, and it's the mind's tendency to forecast outcomes based on stored patterns. So when the mind has enough data indicating that emotional reliance leads to discomfort or instability, that's what it wires into the brain, setting up a network that becomes automatic when they start thinking, I'm safer on my own. That thought literally shapes emotional behavior long before someone consciously identifies it. And then over time, these layers, unpredictability, overload, cultural messages, relational patterns, and predictive forecasting all combine into a single internal toxic thought, which is, don't rely on anyone. It's easier that way. That becomes the internal narrative. And the more this narrative is rehearsed, the stronger it becomes, because whatever we think about the most grows. Hyper-independence can also stem from environments where someone was required to grow up too quickly, when emotional responsibilities exceeded their developmental capacity. The mind adapted by accelerating self-management, not as a strength, though it may look like strength, but as survival. Additionally, hyper-independence often forms in people who once trusted deeply and then were hurt repeatedly. The conscious mind interprets repeated emotional pain as evidence that openness is unsafe. Even if the conscious mind wants connection, the mind-brain loop it set up tightens its boundaries. It is important to note that hyper-independence is not the absence of desire for connection, not at all. People who are hyper-dependent crave closeness. They just don't trust it. They don't trust the stability of it. They don't trust the sustainability of it. And they don't trust their ability to navigate the disappointment of it. So, when we look at the origins of hyper-independence, we are not looking at weakness or stubbornness. We are looking at an adaptation that was wired into the psychoneurobiology. The mind adapted to its environment. It made a decision, often long before you could even verbalize it, that emotional self-reliance was safer than emotional exposure. That's a toxic thought. That's toxic intelligence. Understanding this doesn't remove the pattern, but it does give you some clarity. It allows you to see hyper-independence not as a personality trait, but as a learned response. A response originally built to keep you steady, and one that deserves to be met with compassion rather than criticism. Hyper-independence is often praised because of how it looks on the outside. Capable, decisive, organized, self-contained. But the internal reality is far more complex. Beneath this polished surface is a pattern that slowly reshapes emotional bandwidth, cognitive load, and even identity. This chapter is not about being harsh and judgmental towards yourself. If you recognize this pattern in you, it's about naming the quiet costs you may have never connected to this pattern. One of the most overlooked costs is emotional bottlenecking. When you process everything alone, your thoughts accumulate without relational release. Studies on emotional load show that when feelings remain unshared, they become harder for the conscious mind to actually organize. The absence of some sort of external perspective will increase internal tension. You're not avoiding emotion, you're absorbing all of it without any perspective. And that absorption affects the brain's predictive patterns. When the conscious mind carries the full weight of emotional processing, the brain responds to this mind input by activating toxic stress responses, even in neutral environments. And this leads to a baseline level of vigilance, being very vigilant, subtle, constant, and exhausting. It isn't fear, it's preparation. Preparation for problems that your conscious mind incorrectly believes only you can resolve. Another cost is relational miscalibration. Hyper-independence trains you to underestimate how much support you are allowed to receive or allowing yourself to receive. And it overestimates how much responsibility you are supposed to hold. And so over time, this tilts your relational expectations, and you begin to believe it's normal to carry more than others, normal to speak less than you feel, normal to minimize your needs because it's easier that way. But the conscious mind wasn't designed to navigate relationships through emotional isolation. Research on emotional reciprocity shows that shared expression strengthens clarity, and it reduces cognitive strain, and it increases a sense of internal stability. So when reciprocity back and forth is absent, the conscious mind will compensate by doing double the work. There is also the cost of decision fatigue. When you are the only one evaluating every outcome, every risk, every contingency, the decision-making network in the brain becomes overloaded with the electrochemical stimulation coming from this thought pattern. It's exhausting. The result is not weakness, it's depletion. When the conscious mind is constantly engaged in self-management, its emotional bandwidth is reduced and consumed. However, on the other hand, this emotional bandwidth is enhanced when we activate curiosity and access the intuitive, creative, insightful, and expansive wisdom of our non-conscious mind. A quieter cost shows up in identity itself. Hyper-independence subtly shapes who you believe you are allowed to be. If you have learned to keep your emotions contained, you may start perceiving your needs as intrusions instead of realities that you're allowed to have. In my work studying the mind, I have learned that our mind-brain-body connections are wired to protect us, which also means that they are wired to fill us with doubt. When I first started sharing neuroscience and mental wellness beyond the clinical world, those what-ifs were deafening. What if people don't understand? What if I can't reach the people who need this most? But choosing to push through that mental noise and share tools for mental health and healing, that was one of the best decisions I have ever made. Having Shopify as a partner made it possible to focus on the mission instead of getting lost in the overwhelm. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names to brands just getting started, including mental health educators and wellness practitioners who are changing lives every single day. With hundreds of ready-to-use templates, Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store that matches your brand style. Your healing message looks as professional as it is powerful. Shopify helps you find your customers with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns. Plus, they offer award-winning 24/7 customer support when you need it. It's time to turn those what ifs into sales with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/leaf. Go to shopify.com/leaf. You may see vulnerability as a liability rather than a form of connection. You may confuse isolation because peace is the closest emotional equivalent to predictability. This identity contraction is measurable. Research on relational buffering shows that interactions with emotionally steady people can reduce stress markers and increase resilience. When that buffering is absent or gone, resilience becomes something you must generate alone. Not because you lack support, but because the conscious mind learned to stop expecting it and wire this into the brain. Hyperindependence also narrows the emotional range you feel comfortable expressing, not outwardly, internally. Even joy becomes filtered. You may find yourself downplaying positive experiences because sharing them feels unfamiliar or risky. You may soften excitement to avoid drawing attention to yourself. Emotional expression adapts to the limits of your internal world. The final cost is something most people never really name. Hyperindependence limits the mind's ability to access relational safety from the depths of the insight the unconscious provides. When your world becomes organized around self-containment, safety is defined by control. But real emotional safety requires flexibility. It requires the ability to let people in, not all at once, not unguarded, but in ways that allow the conscious mind to rest. None of this means independence is harmful. Independence is powerful. What makes hyper-independence costly is that it demands emotional endurance without emotional replenishment. It asks you to be a full network of support for yourself when the mind was never designed to function alone. Understanding these costs doesn't mean you must change everything at once. It simply reveals the truth. Hyper-independence doesn't just shape how you act, it shapes how you feel, how you think, and how you experience connection. And once you see those costs clearly, the path towards a healthier form of independence becomes so much easier to recognize. Now, hyper-independence does not develop in isolation. It tends to grow inside a culture that often rewards emotional detachment and applauds people for carrying everything alone. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. To understand why so many people struggle with the idea of needing support, we have to look at our social environment that taught us independence was the only acceptable posture. Modern culture glamorizes the person who never breaks, who works endlessly, who handles pressure without flinching. This ideal is everywhere. Media, narratives, workplace, expectations, family norms. The message is subtle but persistent. Needing less makes you more impressive. But this narrative leaves out the emotional cost entirely. In many societies, hyper-independence is synonymous with competence. That's not a good thing. People are praised for being low maintenance, for not asking for help, for being the steady one others can rely on. Over time, this praise becomes a script, and the script becomes identity. You begin to behave in ways that match the version of yourself others admire, even if it exhausts you. Cultural messages also intersect with identity markers like gender, race, class, and background. For many women, particularly women of color, strength is expected, not celebrated. It's demanded. The cultural narrative teaches them to be endlessly resilient, endlessly composedly available. Vulnerability becomes a luxury. For men, the pressure looks different but feels just as constraining. Hyper-independence is often tied to worth and image. Many are taught that emotional openness is a weakness, that self-reliance defines manhood, and that asking for help undermines authority. These ideas shape not only how they behave, but how they perceive their own emotional needs. There's also the hustle narrative, the belief that you should be able to outwork every obstacle and outpace every challenge. Productivity becomes a form of identity. Rest feels undeserved. Support feels the emotional load grows quietly while the external performance stays polished. Social media reinforces this even further. Online, independence is packaged as a brand. The person who travels alone, succeeds alone, heals alone. The message is clear. Self-sufficiency is aspirational. But the curated independence on screen is rarely the full truth. It hides the emotional context, leaving people to compare their internal struggle with someone else's highlight reel. This builds toxic thinking. Another cultural force driving hyper-independence is the normalization of isolation. We live in a world where people are connected digitally, but increasingly disconnected emotionally. Loneliness has become common, and hyper-independence often appears as the solution. If I stop expecting people to show up, I won't feel disappointed. But adapting to loneliness doesn't resolve it, it reinforces it. Workplace culture adds another layer. High-performing individuals are often rewarded for doing more than their share. The more they carry, the more they are trusted, and the cycle continues. Even when the emotional load becomes heavy, many people grow up hearing messages like, be strong, don't rely on anyone, figure it out yourself. These instructions weren't given to harm, they were given to prepare. But preparation built on emotional suppression becomes hyper-independence in adulthood. Across these cultural influences, a pattern emerges. People learn to associate independence with identity and dependence with inadequacy. The non-conscious mind receives the message long before the conscious self questions it. Hyper-independence becomes not just a pattern but a cultural expectation. So if you understand the cultural mirror, it doesn't excuse the pattern, but it does explain why it feels so hard to soften it. When the world is praising the version of you that carries everything alone, choosing balance can feel almost like rebellion. But rebellion, in this case, is actually healthy, because emotional well-being was never meant to be measured by how little you need. It was meant to be shaped by how deeply you are allowed to exist in connection. Letting people in isn't a personality shift. It's a psycho-neurobiological recalibration. When someone has spent years or even decades navigating life through hyper-independence, the idea of relying on another person can feel quite destabilizing. But that feeling has nothing to do with weakness. It has everything to do with how the conscious mind learned from experiences. The conscious mind uses coping patterns to determine what is safe. When the pattern has been consistent self-reliance, any form of shared emotional experience can feel unfamiliar and then uncomfortable. Not dangerous, just different. And the conscious mind responds with cautious preparation. But here's the nuance we often miss. Connection doesn't demand that you abandon your independence. It asks that you allow flexibility in your independence. Flexibility is what gives the mind room to rest. One of the most powerful findings in relational neuroscience is the concept of emotional co-regulation. Not in a therapeutic sense, but in a practical, everyday sense. When two people share emotion openly, without judgment or defensiveness, the conscious mind experiences a reduction in cognitive strain. This happens because emotional load is no longer being processed alone. The collaborative interaction with people tends to foster the natural collaboration between the conscious and the unconscious mind in the person. This collaboration sends calming brain waves throughout the brain and body, lowering tension and increasing clarity. And this type of collaborative connection between people and the conscious and unconscious mind also rebuilds identity expansion. Beautiful. Research shows that when people interact with emotionally steady, supportive individuals, the mind becomes more flexible. It accesses ideas, creativity, and emotional insight that are harder to reach in isolation and inflexibility. And this isn't because other people fix you. It's because the mind is naturally designed to operate with relational input. Here's a visual that can help illustrate this. Imagine two tuning forks placed next to each other. When one vibrates, the other begins vibrating too. Not because it's being forced, but because resonance travels. In the same way, being in the presence of someone grounded can help your internal world settle. Not because you are incapable of settling yourself, but because the mind recognizes steadiness and mirrors it. Another scientific layer comes from studies on cognitive load. When you carry every emotional weight alone, this disrupts the collaboration of the conscious and the unconscious, which in turn overextends working memory, and then tasks feel heavier. Decisions feel more difficult and sharper. Thought patterns become more rigid and toxic. Shared emotional processing helps create mental spaciousness, and the spaciousness allows the mind to see beyond the immediate stress and access long-term thinking. Allowing others into your life also serves to recalibrate your predictive patterns. Typically, the conscious mind relies on past experiences to forecast future outcomes. When under toxic stress, it often fails to consider all available data, while the non-conscious mind holds a history potentially marked by disappointment and emotional unpredictability. It also possesses the capacity for perspective and the courage required to step forward. Yet, if the conscious mind operates in isolation without consulting this wisdom in us that the non-conscious provides, it will remain trapped in a loop, only anticipating similar negative outcomes. So, introducing new, steady relational experiences provides the conscious mind with fresh data that aligns with a deeper insight from the non-conscious. This process over time enables a shift in predictions, a rewind type effect, and consequently the conscious mind becomes less defensive, less anticipatory, and more receptive. Connection doesn't erase hyper-independence, it softens it. It gives it room to evolve. Many people fear that letting others in will make them lose themselves, but research shows the opposite. Healthy connection strengthens identity. It offers feedback that helps the conscious mind refine its understanding of itself. When someone listens without judgment, your internal narrative becomes more organized. When someone supports your emotional clarity, your internal world becomes more spacious. And this kind of expansion doesn't require full vulnerability or immediate openness. It requires graduated openness, small moments where you allow someone into your emotional landscape, not to carry it, but to witness it. The science is so clear. The mind works better when it has both autonomy and connection. Hyper-independence leans too far towards autonomy, cutting off the relational input that stabilizes and supports cognitive and emotional growth. Letting people in isn't a loss of strength, it's the recalibration of strength. Strength is one of the most misunderstood concepts in our culture, especially when it comes to emotional life. We are taught that strength means handling everything on our own, staying composed, never appearing uncertain, and never needing anything from anyone. But when you examine that definition closely, it becomes clear that's not strength, it's performance. Real strength has nothing to do with isolation, and it has everything to do with flexibility. Flexibility of mind, flexibility of identity, flexibility of connection. Strength is the ability to shift between independence and interdependence without losing yourself in either direction. To understand this reframing, start with this. Independence is a skill. Hyper-independence is a shield. One expands your life, the other restricts it. One is built on choice, the other is built on prediction. The conscious mind learns independence through exploration, curiosity, and autonomy. Hyper-independence, however, forms through repeated exposure to emotional unpredictability. It becomes a conditioned strategy, not a chosen one. And strategies built from emotional bracing can look like strength from the outside while quietly narrowing your internal world. So, reframing or reconceptualizing strength means redefining what you expect from yourself. It means recognizing that doing everything alone is not a requirement for being capable. It also means acknowledging that receiving support or allowing others to witness your internal world does not diminish your resilience, it expands it. In neuroscience, the concept of relational buffering demonstrates this so clearly. When people with supportive connections encounter stress, their conscious mind processes the experience differently. When they access clarity faster, their emotional responses are steadier, their internal dialogue becomes more organized. This isn't dependence, it's relational efficiency. Strength is the ability to adjust, to adapt, to let your conscious mind receive support from the inside and outside without interpreting it as failure. Hyper-independence demands perfection. Genuine strength allows variation. Here's another angle that helps clarify the difference. Hyper-independence is rigid. Rigidity looks stable, but it breaks under pressure. Strength is dynamic. It bends and returns. It allows the full spectrum of emotional experience without collapsing your identity. Think about the version of yourself who's been carrying everything alone. The deadlines, the emotions, the expectations, the internal narratives. Hyper-independence tells you that this is the only way to stay steady. But real strength asks a different question. What if steadiness isn't meant to be carried alone? Reconceptualizing strength isn't about abandoning independence at all, as I keep on stressing. It's about evolving it, changing it. It's about recognizing that the healthiest form of independence includes flexibility, openness, and the willingness to experience life without bracing for impact. As you move forward, hold this truth gently. Strength isn't measured by how much you carry. It is measured by how steadily you can move when you are no longer carrying it alone. If this conversation made you realize how deeply your patterns of independence are wired, and you are ready to gently reshape them, my 21-day brain detox course is the next step I recommend. It's a guided experience that helps you understand your mental patterns with clarity and begin rewiring them through daily science-backed practice. No excess pressure, just structure, support, and a space to work at your own pace. If you want to begin that journey, you can find the course at drleaf.com/courses. As we complete this conversation, I want to bring you back to something simple. Hyper-independence didn't form because you were flawed. It formed because you adapted. Your conscious mind created a structure that kept you functional when emotional consistency wasn't guaranteed. That adaptation deserves respect, not shame. But now, you are at a point where awareness is rising. You are beginning to see the quiet tension under your independence, the automatic bracing that happens before you even speak, the way you carry responsibility without ever asking if you are meant to. And seeing it isn't a weakness, it's an awakening. You are allowed to want connection without losing your autonomy. You are allowed to protect your inner world without isolating it. You are allowed to let people in slowly, intentionally, at a pace that feels grounded instead of forced. If a part of you feels apprehensive, that's totally natural. The mind doesn't immediately relax when a long-standing pattern is questioned. But the very fact that you are thinking about this tells me you're ready for something more spacious than the life you have been holding together alone. You don't have to stop being independent. You just don't have to be independent against yourself. The version of you who carried everything alone was strong. The version of you who learns to carry things differently will be even stronger. You deserve support that doesn't cost you your identity. You deserve steadiness that doesn't require emotional compression. And you deserve connection that doesn't ask you to shrink. Let this be the moment you stop confusing self-protection with self-respect and start allowing room for the life your mind has been preparing you to receive. See you next time.